Dear friends, I am Professor Filip Kovacevic, and this is the 28th edition of the Russian newspaper's Monitor. I hope you are doing well today. Thank you for your comments and feedback. I would like to ask you to consider becoming a member of the Newsbud community and help us develop even more programming like this one. Newsbud is independent, people-oriented media organization and is entirely supported by you, the viewers. Now, let's take a look at the front page news stories in major Russian newspapers. Today, we'll begin with Izvestia, a moderate pro-government newspaper, the edition for April 7, 2017. On the top of the front page, there is an article entitled St. Petersburg, or as Russians call it, Peter, we are with you. The subtitle explains that the gatherings in remembrance of the victims of the recent St. Petersburg terrorist attacks took place in many cities in Russia. Below the subtitle, there is a photograph of a woman releasing a white dove against the background of lighted candles. The article reports that the gatherings, which also included a strong anti-terrorist message, took place in all Russian big cities, including Moscow, Vladivostok, and Tyumen. The gathering in Moscow numbered more than 50,000 people. In St. Petersburg, the people gathered on the square by the metro station where the terrorist attack took place. According to the article, more than 5,000 people were on the square. The stage was constructed, and several well-known St. Petersburg political figures made speeches, including the governor of St. Petersburg, Georgy Poltavchenko, and the president of the Legislative Assembly, Vyacheslav Makarov. According to the article, Poltavchenko stated that the terrorists wanted to create the atmosphere of high anxiety and tension, but that they had failed. The city and its population resisted and said a resolute no to those who desired chaos and destruction. Makarov, in his turn, said that for the heinous crimes like this one, Russia should reinstitute the death penalty, and he called on the Russian Duma to do so in the coming period. Other speakers underscored the fact that terrorism is a global challenge to security and that the entire international community should come together to fight against it. After the speeches were over, the white doves were released from the stage, one for each life that was tragically cut short by the attack. According to the article, the gathering in Moscow was bigger than the one in St. Petersburg. People of various ages and professions were present, from the students to the retired. The article quotes one of the participants, a retired school teacher, Tatyana Ivanova, who says that the government needs to do more to get the young people away from radicalization. According to the article, some people claimed that they were told by their employers to come to the gathering, which suggests that there was some degree of coordination with the government networks. Also, just like in St. Petersburg, politicians from the pro-government political parties gave speeches and called for civic solidarity and more counter-terrorist measures. What needs to be kept in mind is that just 2 weeks ago, there were mass anti-government protests in both Moscow and St. Petersburg, organized by the Western-supported political activist Alexei Navalny and his associates. The mood on those protests was much different, and it is no wonder that the protests were not sanctioned by the city authorities. There were numerous arrests, though the vast majority of the arrested was soon released. Now we have the answer of the government side. In this case, the government supporters took to the streets. Of course, the cause of the gatherings was noble and legitimate. However, the gatherings also made it impossible for the pro-Western opposition to organize any government protests this week. It is clear that the more time passes from the initial protests of March 26, the more difficult it may be to organize them again. In my opinion, this is precisely what the Russian government wants. As we have seen in the past, the government can also organize its own protests, its own supporters, to protest in support of the government measures and against the opposition. However, I still think that the current Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev will be replaced by the President Vladimir Putin in the coming period. The frequency and seriousness of the internal terrorist threat may easily be used by Putin to justify putting a fellow Silovik, a KGB veteran, in charge of the government. I've long said that Putin's choice will be Nikolai Patrushev, the ex-head of the FSB and the current secretary of the Russian Security Council. I'm sure that Putin is about to institute a government shakeup and replace the remaining liberals. We'll stay with Izvestia, a moderate pro-government newspaper, but we'll take a look at the front page of another edition, the edition for April 10, 2017. In the middle of the front page, Izvestia presents an exclusive interview with the ambassador of Syria in Russia, Riyad Haddad. The title of the interview is a quote from Haddad: "The aggression of the United States is a reaction to the success of the Syrian government." Below the title, there is a photograph of Haddad with the caption, "Riyad Haddad calls Russia the main ally of the Syrian government." In the interview, the Syrian ambassador Haddad accuses the United States of the aggression against the sovereign government and also the violation of international law. He states that the US attack was coordinated with terrorist groups such as ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, which went on the offensive against the Syrian government as soon as the US attack on the Syrian military airport took place. According to Haddad, this demonstrates that both ISIS and al-Nusra knew of the US preparations for the attack and were ready to take advantage of it. He states that the same covert cooperation is taking place in Iraq. Haddad rejects the US government narrative of the use of chemical weapons against civilians by the Syrian government as a justification for the attack, and says that, in his opinion, the attack was ordered by the US President Donald Trump as a reaction to the recent military successes of the Syrian military in cooperation with the Russian military in the regions of the capital city of Damascus and the city of Homs. Haddad also states that the Syrian government has no chemical weapons in its possession and that its membership in the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons shows that it has complied with the international demand to ship all of its chemical weapons out of the country. In addition, Haddad praises the decision by Russia to stop sharing the military flight data information with the United States, because the United States has shown that it is not committed to the fight against terrorism in Syria. On the other hand, Haddad considers Russia as the most important global actor on the counter-terrorist front, and also the most significant ally of the Syrian government. Lastly, Haddad states that he did not think that the US President Donald Trump had suddenly become the puppet of the Pentagon, and I can add here the deep state, but that he has simply continued the business as usual in Washington, D.C., that is, the decades-long global hegemonic project grounded in the politics of double standards. For our friends, anything; for our enemies, the law. Nothing new under the sun. In my opinion, the fact that a major pro-government newspaper in Russia featured on its front page the interview with a high-level Syrian government official who, in very harsh terms, criticized the decisions of the US President Donald Trump shows that all the hopes of détente between the US and Russia have been crushed. This is something that I predicted for quite a long time. It means that we will see the intensification of hostilities on all fronts, from the Baltics to the Balkans and the Black Sea. I expect the violence to flare up in a major way in Ukraine as well as in Afghanistan. The Russian military and intelligence networks are no doubt preparing their response to Trump. Where, when, and how they will strike is of course a highly classified secret. I'm sure that the methods of what's called hybrid warfare will be used. Who knows? Perhaps if the Russians do indeed have compromising material on Trump, they might release some of it in the coming weeks. However, I think that NATO might try to preempt the Russian efforts by speeding up the Gladio Sea operations in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. We may see clashes between the unknown militants and the police in the countries that have been peaceful so far. Belarus, Kazakhstan, Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, and Greece are all on this list. Turkey will also be subject to the major Western destabilization efforts in the days prior to the April 16th referendum. The public support of the Turkish government for the US military action against Bashar al-Assad, in addition to calling Assad a murderer, will do nothing to slow down the CIA-NATO plans to depose the Turkish President Erdogan. But it remains to be seen whether he has truly learned the lessons of the July 15 coup. The Western intelligence agencies have no intention of giving him the second chance. Now, let's take a look at the front page of Kommersant, the most prominent liberal newspaper in Russia, which is frequently critical of the government's economic and foreign policy agenda, the edition for April 11, 2017. On the top of the front page, there is an article about the most recent crisis in the relations between Russia and Turkey. The title of the article states, "The Russians wrest from Turkey," an obviously ironic play on words, "The Russians wrest in Turkey." The subtitle explains that the Russian aviation agency, Rosaviatsia, might prohibit the plane flights to Turkey once again. Right below the title, there is a photograph, presumably taken at a Russian airport, showing the gate for the flight to Antalya, probably the Russians' most popular tourist resort in Turkey. The article explains that the latest disagreement between Russia and Turkey on Syria, caused by the US strikes against the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, appears to push Russia to retaliate against Turkey using economic means. The Russian Aviation Agency issued a formal statement announcing that it was possible that the charter plane flights to Turkey might be banned again. The article claims that this would be a catastrophic event for the Turkish tourist industry. According to the data presented in the article, the Russian tourist agencies have already sold up to 400,000 travel arrangements to Russians wanting to spend their summer in Turkey. Overall, the Turks expected more than 3 million Russians to visit Turkey this year alone. Now, all these expectations and opportunities for profit-making have been placed under the shadow of doubt and uncertainty. Hundreds of millions of dollars are at stake. The article notes that the Russian Aviation Agency already banned the flights to Turkey at the end of 2015, after the Turkish military aircraft shot down the Russian bomber Su-24, which was taking part in the Russian military intervention in Syria. The flights were then resumed in September 2016, sometime after the official apology by the Turkish President Erdogan, who survived a coup 2 months earlier. However, the economic relations have still not completely normalized, as the Russians have held on to the prohibition of the imports of the Turkish tomatoes and other vegetables, and the Turks put an enormous tariff of 130% on the Russian wheat, corn, cooking oil, and rice. Now, with the opposing narratives regarding the recent US bombing against the Syrian military airport, the matters may easily escalate even further. According to the anonymous sources cited in the article, the Kremlin was angry at the reaction of the Turkish government, and the President Erdogan, who not only approved of the US strikes, but also called the US to strike again until the full defeat of Assad. The Kremlin might see the Turkish reaction as a betrayal of recent agreements between Putin and Erdogan. When Erdogan visited Moscow a few weeks ago, he referred to Putin as his friend twice during the press conference. Putin might take the most recent Erdogan statement on Assad and his actions as well as a betrayal of this friendship. It is not difficult to see that the statements about the possible banning of the flights to Turkey as a way to put pressure on Erdogan to remember what he promised and to modify his attitude toward Assad. Of course, one can also interpret the recent Erdogan statements as a part of the campaign to win the referendum on constitutional changes, which is to be held on April 16, which would substantially increase his powers as president. However, in my opinion, Erdogan is playing with fire. If the Kremlin, that is to say Putin, determines that Erdogan cannot be trusted, I think his political fate is sealed. Erdogan has made a lot of enemies in the EU and the US, and there is no way that he can go back into their embrace and still survive politically and maybe even physically. His best bet is to augment his cooperation with the Russians. This, of course, is easier said than done, because Russia, as a great nuclear power arising again from the ashes of the Soviet collapse, demands that Erdogan plays by their rules. They want Erdogan to become Russia-friendly, both geopolitically and also economically. They want the Turkish market open for the Russian products and the Turkish military buying the Russian-produced weapons. So far, Erdogan has vacillated quite a lot, and this may greatly affect his political future in Turkey. I've said long ago that NATO strategists have planned to attack Russia via Turkey, and that this plan would already have been put into action had the July 2016 coup succeeded. The goal of the Gulenists, just like that of their sponsors in the CIA, is the eventual breakup of Russia along ethnic lines, hence the support for the Chechens in the 1990s. However, the danger of the violent confrontation, which would be devastating for Russia but much more damaging for Turkey, has not passed. In addition, it could even be that the fate of Erdogan's victory on April 16th also hangs in balance. The US and the EU clearly desire the referendum to fail, and it is difficult to see how the referendum can be successful if there is no political and logistical support from the other side. Erdogan may have backed himself into a geopolitical corner, and this time around Putin may not be willing to help. At the same time, however, Putin does not have much choice. Any other Turkish leader who could replace Erdogan is bound to be more anti-Russian. So the give-and-take game between Putin and Erdogan will no doubt continue, and the danger of imminent global conflagration may pass from the Middle East to East Asia and the US-North Korean standoff. Next, we'll take a look at the front page of Nezavisimaya Gazeta, the middle-of-the-road newspaper, the edition for April 11, 2017. In the middle of the front page, there is an article entitled "Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, will pay the debt to Gazprom using Russian credits." The subtitle explains that the new loans may be a big problem for the Belarusian economy. Below the subtitles, there is a photograph of the Belarus Vice Prime Minister Vladimir Semashko, and the caption reads, "Semashko informed the people about the new loans." The article reports that as a part of the deal made between the Russian President Vladimir Putin and Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko, who recently met in St. Petersburg, Russia agreed to loan Belarus $1 billion, in addition to approving 2 lines of credit from the Eurasian Fund for Stabilization and Development. According to the article, this money is necessary for Belarus to pay outstanding debts to Russia. And so, on surface, it looks paradoxical. Russia is giving money to Belarus so that Belarus can pay back its debts to Russia. However, if we look at this geopolitically, it makes a lot of sense. The Belarusian economy is in crisis, and unless Russia helps it out at this time, it may crush and destabilize one of the few border regions in which Russia does not feel threatened. Belarus is Russia's key ally in its opposition to NATO in Eastern Europe. Therefore, under no circumstances can Putin let Belarus fall under the influence of the other side. Lukashenko knows this, and this is why he is able to get such good deals from the Russian side. According to the article, Belarus owes Russia for natural gas it obtained from the Russian gas and oil giant Gazprom, and they owe about $700 million. It is also clear that the credit given by Russia will be spent on paying back this debt. This will also make possible the continued shipment of oil to Belarus, which was stopped due to the existing Belarusian debts to Russia. The optimists are hoping that this would be enough to get the Belarusian economy out of the crisis. The critics, however, are doubtful and think that Russia might be wasting its money on a leader who is willing to blackmail it at every turn of the road. But just as in the case of the Turkish President Erdogan, Lukashenko is the only option that the Russians have. Any other candidate in Belarus could be much worse for the Russian national security interests. The article notes that the total Russian credit to Belarus, if we add the credit lines from the Eurasian Fund, will be around $2.4 billion. This is exactly the amount of money that Belarus was seeking from the IMF, one of the most significant instruments of the Western neoliberal global power. By providing Belarus with the credit, Putin rescued Belarus from having its economy devastated by the IMF's so-called structural adjustment loans, which wreaked havoc in Russia in the second part of the 1990s. What Putin will probably ask in return, and this is something I already mentioned in the last show, is the permanent stationing of the Russian military in Belarus. The article reports that the Russian credit can only provide a temporary relief for the Belarusian economy, which suffers from corruption and inefficiency. What will happen in a few years is anybody's guess. But as a short-term measure, taking into consideration the hostile geopolitical context in Eastern Europe, with more and more NATO troops being rotated into the region, the Kremlin acted rationally and in pursuit of its own national interest. Some critics point out that the Kremlin subsidized the Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych in the same way, and then when he was overthrown, the new Kiev government reneged on all its debts to Russia and Gazprom in particular. However, as I already pointed out, Russia has no political replacement for Lukashenko and is therefore forced to play this game, even though I'm sure there is no love lost between him and Putin. Lastly today, we'll take a look at the Russian semi-tabloid press, the front page of Argumenty и Facty, a weekly Russian tabloid, the edition for April 12, 2017. Covering the entire front page is a photo collage of the US President Donald Trump, literally sitting on the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and trying to hit him in the head with a Tomahawk missile. The collage is supposed to convey the brutality of Trump's decision. The title of the article is a question: the attacks by Tomahawks in the name of peace? The full discussion is provided on pages 4 and 5 of the newspaper. There we find a subtitle on the top of the page: Syria, the new Cuban Missile Crisis, referring to the dramatic events of October 1962, when the United States and the Soviet Union came close to a nuclear confrontation. The article consists of an interview given to the newspaper by Viktor Murachovsky, the chief editor of the Russian military magazine The Arsenal of the Fatherland. Murachovsky repeats the Russian official narrative that the Syrian military hit the factory in which the rebels produced chemical weapons, which were then released in the air. However, Murachovsky also points out that it is relatively easy to provoke the physical reaction similar to the reaction caused by the sarin nerve gas by spraying some other chemical substances into people's faces. Therefore, he does not exclude the possibility of a grand simulation by the rebels. He knows that the area in question is under the control of the organization called Jabhat Fath al-Sham, which used to be called Jabhat al-Nusra, and which cooperated with Al-Qaeda in Syria in an earlier period. the Russian government considers Jabhat Fatah al-Sham a terrorist organization, while the US refers to it as armed Syrian opposition. This situation very much resembles the narrative about the so-called Kosovo Liberation Army in the late 1990s, which almost overnight ceased to be defined by the US State Department as a terrorist organization when it started implementing NATO geopolitical agenda in the Balkans. Murachowski also states that the Syrian government gave up all its chemical weapons, and that this fact was certified not only by the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, but also by the United States. According to him, the last Syrian chemical weapons were destroyed in Texas in 2016. And so the question he asked is, how could Bashar al-Assad use chemical weapons if he does not have them anymore? Clearly, the conclusion that Murachowski comes to is that this was a setup, a false flag operation designed in order to provoke the US military reaction. In addition, Murachowski says that it was a sensible decision for Russia to discontinue sharing the flight data of its military planes and the planes of the Syrian government with United States-led coalition, because this data was used by the United States to plan and execute the attack. In his opinion, the next step for Russia will be to strengthen the Syrian anti-missile defense and spend more time and effort to train the Syrian army personnel against the attacks from the air. In my opinion, the article shows that the mood for the US-Russian cooperation in Syria has quickly soured in the Kremlin. The Russians will stick with the Syrian government, and the more the US and its allies demand Bashar al-Assad's ouster, the stronger they will support him. The defense of Assad has become the source of national pride for the Russian military and is a symbol of the renaissance of Russia as a great power. I think it would be wise for the warmongers in Washington and Brussels to keep this in mind at all times. Unless, of course, they want to cause a global war, which I'm also not excluding as a possibility. The situation in Europe has greatly deteriorated in the last few weeks. Anything is possible, especially if Marine Le Pen wins the French elections. I think the next few months, especially the months of May and June, will be extremely important in this respect. I see a big crisis looming. You can rest assured that here at Newsbud we will follow all the events closely, and that you will be among the first to find out all the implications. Dear friends, that's all for today. Thank you for watching. Please consider becoming a member of the Newsbud community or making a donation. And of course, be cool and stay cool until the next edition of the Russian newspapers Monitor.
This is a special announcement. Newsbud is proud to offer something you won't find on other news sites. Welcome to Newsbud Academy. For the first time, Newsbud is offering online courses brought to you by the top experts in their field. The first course offered by Newsbud Academy is the Foundation of Anglo-American and Russian Geopolitics, hosted by Professor Filip Kovacevic. Professor Filip Kovacevic has taught all over the globe. He has been invited to lecture throughout the US, Europe, and the former Soviet Union. Professor Kovacevic currently teaches at the University of San Francisco. The first Newsbud Academy will be offered on the weekend of Saturday, June 10th and Sunday, June 11th, but the enrollment period starts now. Registration is limited for the Newsbud Academy, so go to newsbud.com for more information and sign up today.